Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Daniel Wildmann. I'm the director of the Leo Baeck Institute London, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you from wherever you are, being staying in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in the USA, in Israel, and also in China, to tonight's lecture. Tonight's lecture is part of the Leo Baeck Institute Lecture Series 2021, Conceptions of Heimat in Jewish Visual History and Culture. Let me give you some technical advice for this online event first. To give you the best possible access to the talk, please select full screen, and then we would advise you to activate the mode Show Active Speaker Video, as shown in the slide you are seeing now. You can select this option by clicking on the top bar of the frame that is showing windows with the participants. There you will see three options. Click on the white icon in the middle. Please note that you also have the option to enlarge the speaker window by pulling the left button of this frame down. These actions will only alter the view on your screen, so you can adjust the size of the speaker window at your own convenience during the talk. The Leo Baeck Lecture Institute Lecture Series is organized jointly by the Leo Baeck Institute and the German Historical Institute London. I'm therefore very happy to give way to Professor Christina von Hodenberg, the director of the GHI. Christina, over to you.
Thank you, Daniel, and a very warm welcome from me as well as director of the German Historical Institute. My name is Christina von Hodenberg, and I'm very happy that we are able to collaborate with the Leo Baeck Institute London on its lecture series, and we have done so for many years. It feels a tiny bit fraudulent for me to welcome you to this particular series on Zoom, because normally we would obviously be at the beautiful building of the GHIL at Bloomsbury Square in London, and we would be able to properly welcome you and to provide our facilities and invite you to a wine reception and so on. So all of this actually falls a tiny bit flat tonight, but at least we have the opportunity to welcome so many of you from different corners of the world in tonight's audience because we are online. And we will obviously continue to support the LBI and its lecture series, also once that we will go back to physical events, real events, hopefully later this year. I particularly look forward to Ofer Ashkenazi's lecture tonight, because the GHIL does not only have an interest in German Jewish history, but also in particular, there are some of our scholars who work on visual objects, particularly photographs, and the methods that historians apply in working with them. And also I'm very interested in concepts of belonging and kinship and how this is being constructed in history. And so I very much look forward to this particular lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. And my thanks go out to you and the German Historical Institute. It's always a real pleasure and also honor to work with you. And we are really looking very, very much forward to come back to your extremely beautiful building and Nash House. It's so beautiful there. And let's hope we can do it next year there. Our topic, conceptions of Heimat in Jewish visual history and culture, is quite a political topic. And it's also a very emotional topic. Heimat is always about belonging and feelings, about inclusion and exclusion, about becoming part of it and about losing it, but also about creating it. And today's topic, Jewish private photography in Nazi Germany, is a case in point. I'm therefore very happy to welcome tonight's guest speaker, Professor Ofer Ashkenazi. Ofer is Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Richard Koebner Minerva Center for German History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Ofer has also been a fellow at the Katz Center at the University of Pennsylvania and a visiting scholar at the University of Göttingen. His main research areas are Central European cultural and intellectual history, modern visual culture, and Jewish urban experience in 20th century Europe. He has published extensively, really widely, in all these fields. And let me just remember at least two of his monographs. And this is the first one. I hope you can see it properly. Weimar Film and Modern Jewish Identity, published in 2012 with Palgrave Macmillan. And this is the second one. And here we are. Anti-Heimat Cinema, the Jewish Invention of the German Landscape, published in 2021 with University of Michigan Press. Actually, has just come out about 4 or 5 weeks ago. It's really new. Currently, Ofer is already working on a new book, a new project on Jewish photography in Nazi Germany. And tonight's lecture, he will present his first research results. So tonight, Ofer is going to speak about Heimat as a shelter from Nazism. Ofer, over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this very generous introduction. Thank you, Daniel and Christina, for inviting me for this lecture series, which has been very interesting so far. I hope to contribute to it. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, so as Daniel has said, my project, the research project, looks at the ways Jews in Nazi Germany documented their lives in the face of Nazism, their everyday routine, the places where they lived and where they visited, private events, and so forth. This is a project that I conduct together within a group of scholars that includes Sarah Segev and Rebecca Grossman and Shira Meron. Now, when we look at private photographs of German Jews in the 1930s, of family albums, private collections, and so forth, one of the most recurrent themes in them is the German provincial landscape, with visual imagery associated with Heimat. I would like today to discuss the omnipresence of Heimat in Jewish private photography and to contemplate its significance for the historians of German Jewry under Nazism. Now, in order to talk about the meanings of Heimat, the significance of Heimat in their photographs, I would like to introduce two concepts. One of them, I would like to suggest to look at photographs, private photographs, as what Desserteau called tactics, meaning the communication of the weak, the use of the language in a way that would communicate the position, the perceptions of the ones that are outcast in this society. And the second one will be what I would call the modes of expressions in the photograph, the position of the photograph vis-a-vis the reality it displays. So I will get to that shortly. Before that, I would like to begin with a few words on private Jewish photography in the 1930s. The introduction of cheap, small, and easy to use cameras in the latter half of the 1920s resulted in the popularization of photography, and in the early 1930s, scholars estimate that almost every second family in Germany had at least one camera. The numbers go even higher when we think of the middle class, where most of German Jewry belonged to. When we ask ourselves who took photos, so it's men, women, teenagers, young girls, young boys, and the elderly. Basically, everyone took photos. Not only that they took photos, they also had a very good concept of what constitutes a good photograph. There were various magazines, manuals for photography, the aesthetic of photography, how you take a good photograph and so forth. Even for kids, as you can see here, for the manual Otto's Photos that was geared to children. It was also easy to develop the photographs at home. You could just have a dark room at home, so there was access to everyone. I would like to say that even though the National Socialist regime wanted to control the documentation of Germany after 1933, to control the representations of Germany, they did very little to stop Jewish private photography. I can talk more about it in the Q&A, but we can see that until the late 1930s, there were even Jewish photo shops where people could develop their film, buy cameras, and so forth. And Jews also would go to non-Jewish businesses to do that. That was not a problem at all. So if we talk in general about Jews in 1930s Germany, we see that everyone was taking photographs, or almost everyone was taking photographs. They were photo literate. They knew how to constitute a good photograph. They understood the meaning of it. They had access to development and to cameras and so forth. They also had incentive to take photos, either as mementos of their lifestyles, of their possessions, and also as an establishment of class belonging in the class that takes photos. Moreover, they were also aware of the political aspect of photography. Goebbels talked very early on his vision of an army of millions of amateur photographers that would document and show the spirit of the soul. And the Jewish newspapers basically repeat the same words. They're talking about their own army of amateur photographers and so forth. This is not to say that everyone saw himself as the soldiers of the nation, but they were aware of the political aspects of private photography. Now, private photography is a very problematic topic for historians. We talk about non-professional photographers and photographs that were preserved and used privately, so not for art, commercial, or propaganda purposes. And that means that there is hardly any documentation of intentions. We do not know why a certain photographer took a certain photograph in a certain way. We talk about vernacular or banal imagery, capturing private environment, family routines, private events. We can talk about it as absent-minded imagery, often snapshots, conventional aesthetics, themes, iconography. So not the materials that historians would usually choose to write about, and it's usually outside of the historiography. Now I would like to explain why I think we can look at them from historians' point of view, and what do we need to have in mind. So the first premise that I would like to suggest is that it is important who takes the photograph and who compiles the album. Photographs do not have objective meaning. Historians should disclose the significance it had for the people who took and compiled them, the people who preserved the photographs, developed them and preserved them. In other words, it means if you look at this photo here of Hitlerjugend parade and the Arbeitsdienst parade, I would argue that it's important that the person who took them was a Jewish teenager, and this was his words. The photograph that we saw before of Herbert Simon Again, it has a different meaning for the Jewish family who took it than it would have been for non-Jewish family in the same circumstances. Now, the second premise is that the subjective significance, or better, the effect of the image, is not explicitly articulated. Neither the production nor the understanding of its necessary understanding of it is necessarily conscious. Now, so far, not much of it is new. This is exactly why serious historians are hesitant to use private photography as a historical source. Thus, this would bring me to the third premise. I would argue that private photography should be read as tactics. Michel de Certeau argued that, or labeled tactics as the particular appropriation of the language of the powerful to manifest the position and the perception of the powerless. He talked about use of the language that would shed a different light on the language of a certain place. Even though he talks about verbal language mostly at this point, he also emphasizes the visual element. He talks about tactics as a maneuver within the enemy's field of vision. When we talk about photographs as a maneuver within the enemy's field of vision, we are talking about the appropriation of iconography, of familiar imagery by people who are outside of this discourse, or people that the discourse mark as outsiders. Look, for example, at this image by in the album of Friedel Wollemstedt, a Jewish teenager with their friends walking in nature. If you know even a little bit about German visual culture, you obviously know this image already from the iconography of the Wandervogel of the time. I wonder when the Wandervogel talked about rejuvenation of the German nature, of authentic belonging in nature and so forth. When Jewish teenagers in 1935 are doing it, it obviously has a different meaning. They take it out of context and bring it, give it a different layer of meaning. Again, for them, not objective. What is this significance here? We'll talk shortly. Before that, I want to introduce another concept, and this is the modes of expression. In my writing, I usually use three modes: pathos, irony, and abstraction. I will use here, I will show here two of them that are relevant for Heimat. The modes of expressions are the formal elements of the photograph that determine its approach to the reality it displays. Let me explain with the example of pathos. Now, pathos has obviously different meanings, many different meanings. I only use one of them here, a very specific one, as the appropriation of familiar symbolism in a way that interweaves mundane experience of Jews, in this case, with basic elements of German national culture. This is not my invention. I took it from Abi Warburg's pathos formula that talks about linking the image to emotionally charged configuration, familiar configuration, that appears as manifestation of communal crisis, or the inherent connection between the banal circumstances of the photographs and the fundamentals of the culture in which they take place. In a way, these modes of expressions that I'm talking about are similar to what Hayden White called the mode of employment. The composition here of the photographs, of elements of the photographs, corresponds with specific position vis-a-vis the reality depicted in the photos or series of photos. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's look at this one of the Rosenthal family from Berlin. Albert Rosenthal, here is the second from the right. He was a rabbi, PhD and principal of a Jewish school in Berlin. Here is on vacation on the Alps in 1937 with his family, and it's a banal tourist photograph, a family photograph. In order to explain how it is related to Heimat and how it is related to pathos and what can we get from it, I would like to get to a different image. This is a cliche Heimat style postcard, and it's very good to explain what Heimat style is. If we go back to the booklet about how to write a good Heimat literature by Adolf Bartel from 1924, and Bartel explains that a good Heimat imagery should include the church spire, more or less in the middle. That is a symbol of connection to the church, but also to tradition. It needs to have the slopes on either sides as a symbol of security and the isolation of the place. It needs to have the woods with symbols of rootedness. There should be some farmhouses, Bartel says. Some of them should be in the far background and some of them should be close. Again, as a symbol of home. And there should be roads that connect the house and connect the village with other villages. So it is part of one German nation. When we look back at Rosenthal's, again, very banal photograph, we see that it has the same element. It has this church spire, again, in the middle, the two slopes, the woods, the farmhouse, far and close, and here it's even more striking. The home is right above the heads of the family members. So if it's a symbol of homeliness, of being at home, it's very well connected to them. And we see the roads that leads from the village outside to the rest of the world. Here in the photo, the road ends with the Jewish family. In other words, what Rosenthal is doing is placing this Jewish family on vacation, a bourgeois Jewish family on vacation, at the center of this image of the German Heimat. So if Heimat is about authentic connection to the place, authentic belonging to a place, the Jewish family on vacation is at the center of all that. Heimat appears in photographs not only on the mountains or somewhere else, like in nature, but also at home. As you can see here, in many kitsch paintings on the walls that are often find themselves in the family albums. Again, here when we talk about pathos, you can see that this kitschy Heimat painting is right above the heads of the family members. We have 3 generations of the family that form a pyramid that goes up towards this Heimat, some kind of, you can think about it as an arrow that points from the family to Heimat. And here it's strengthened also by belonging to the province with this sign of nobility of the Braunschweig nobility that appears as if it was one of the faces, one of the heads of the family in this photo. The pathos is complete with the caption of the photograph that says, letzte Aufnahme aus Zalder, the last photographs from Zalder of the family. So this very banal moment of the photograph turns with this Heimat at the center to pathos-ridden image of the tension between belonging and the need to live because of the circumstances under Nazism. I'll give you another example. This one is a very conventional album made for the little girl Lilo Liselotte Dienemann, and it describes her upbringing, just stations in her lives, from infancy to her friends, some relatives. Here is the father. Except for two images in the album. One of them is this image that you can see here, which is totally unrelated to any other photos. If all the other photos are from the 1930s, all the other photos are taken from short range and basically show nothing of the reality in Germany. It shows nothing about their Jewishness, obviously. This photograph shows the father in the First World War in the front, together with other soldiers, and incorporates the story of the father in the war, the contribution to the war effort, and if you wish, the national crisis during the war, with the story of the Lieselotte's upbringing. Obviously, they also make a point about the father, just like everyone else, his Jewishness does not separate him from the others, and for that, you can see here that they marked him in X, just so we will know that we need the X because he does look like everyone else. So this is part of the story of bourgeois upbringing in Germany. Then the second image that we have in the album that is not part of this short range, totally normal, banal bourgeois life is this one that basically begins the album with a, again, kitschy drawing and a poem with the title Traute Heimat, Beloved Heimat. And the poem says that it doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter if the days are hard, the sons of the Heimat glances at you everywhere you are. So the whole story of her upbringing is within the framework of Heimat, related to Heimat. Heimat is part of her life story. And of course, it's very relevant because they send, the parents of Lieselotte send the album to her. She's in Sweden when she gets it with the Kindertransport. So Heimat is part of their life, even if she's not there. Now, this is interesting. All the examples that I showed so far are related to the discourse, the Jewish discourse about Heimat in Germany at the time. Usually when we think about Heimat in the Jewish discourse, we think of this popular view of Jews belonging in the German Heimat for century, and we can think of PhD dissertations in the 1920s that show the Jewish rootedness and settledness in Germany, and there is a lot of effort, even under Nazism, to show that we were here for centuries and so forth. Then there is the other approach that says, well, Jews actually do not belong in Germany. Germany is not the Jewish Heimat. Some of them will say Jews are, the wandering Jews of history that are, they do not belong in any Heimat, and others, mostly the Zionists, will say, well, the land of Israel, Palestine, is the real Jewish Heimat and not Germany. However, there is another approach that usually is kind of outside of the mainstream of these discussions, of scholars' discussion. This is approach that we can see in writers like Kurt Tucholsky or Rabbi Prinz, Joachim Prinz. And this approach says Jews belong in the German Heimat because the German Heimat is bourgeois construction. It's to belong in the German Heimat means belong in the German bourgeoisie, in the German bourgeois culture. That's what makes us part of the German Heimat, the love of Heimat, if you will. And when we look at photo albums, we see that this marginal approach is basically everywhere in family albums. This is the most accepted approach among Jews in Nazi Germany. We can talk more about it in the Q&A. Let me move further to show you some more examples. And here I think we get into an interesting territory. The same thing that we could say about Heimat so far is also relevant for Zionist photograph. So it's a photograph of Zionists in Germany. You can see here Chaim Yadid's album of the Chalutz seminar in Mannheim. This is a Zionist seminar. They went there for a few weeks in the summer of 1934. And this is the page that opened the whole album description of the seminar. So you can see here that you have some images from the building of the seminar when they have all their discussions and activities and so forth, but also it comes with a montage of some generic German Heimat from the Heidelberg area. And what they do, they incorporate German Heimat within the Zionist story, within the Zionist endeavor. The German Heimat is part of the Zionist story in this album. And again, as I said, we can see it again and again in albums of Zionist groups. In Eva Weiss's album, they take it even further. Here you can see everything we saw before of the generic Heimat photographs with the church spires, the slopes, the woods, the farmhouses and the roads, everything but the Zionist camp is part of it, is part of Heimat. So if you will, Heimat is part of the of being Zionist, the Zionist place, if you will. What's interesting is that in this album, this page of Das Lager, of the camp, the Zionist camp, is between two other pages. One is from Frankfurt when they leave Germany, and the other one is from Palestine, from Hadera. Heimat is this in-between space where Zionism is formed, the Zionist group is formed, becomes a group between the two homelands, if you will. So until now, I talked about pathos. I want to add now another layer, and this is the mode of expression that I call irony. Now, again, just like pathos, irony has different shades and different definitions. I take one very narrow one to describe this phenomenon that I see. So I think of irony as an expression or utterance marked by contrariness of meaning, saying something other that is understood. When we talk about visual, or sometimes some scholars call it dramatic irony, is when one of the elements of the photographs, or in a combination between the photographs and its context in the album, suggests a different, contrasting reading of the photograph. In other words, irony is a strategy, or we can say tactics, that appears to accept the terms of the common sense and received wisdom, but ultimately exposes the ordinary language to be inadequate. And this is very important in Jewish family albums, and especially with regard to Heimat. I want to show you a couple of examples. Take this photograph from the private albums of the Porat family. Back then they were called Freund family. This is a classic Heimat image. You can see that it has this triangle of the farmhouses in the middle, where one of the heads of the triangle is the manor house, a symbol of the political order. In the other head, you have the church spire, symbol of tradition, if you will, and obviously Christianity. And the other hand is the lone tree with as a symbol of rootedness, and so on and so forth. And even the title they give this image in the album is a cliche of Heimat photography, Landschaft im Oberschlesien, just a landscape in Oberschlesien. Again, we have this very full of pathos image. But it is important to note that they take this image from the train, from the window of the train, when they are going, like good bourgeois people, they're going on a ski vacation in Eastern Germany. So on their ski vacation, from the window, they see this perfect image of Heimat. So it rings like the pathos we saw before. However, in the album, it comes together with this image that you see here, as if the mother is looking out the window and sees that. But when you look carefully, you see two things. First, her eyes are closed, as if she doesn't see it. It's some kind of a dream. And in any case, because of the light from the camera, it sees that she doesn't see anything. I mean, she might see, but in the photo, what we see is that she doesn't see anything. This is blank. So this is all in her head, if you will, a fantasy. So the whole idea of Heimat and all the idea of belonging in the Heimat by belonging in the bourgeoisie seems here with this combination like a daydream or a fantasy. So through irony, we criticize or have a critical commentary on the idea that we saw before. We can go back here to the same Karl Rosenthal, the rabbi, doctor, and principal, and part of his album is those pathos-ridden images that we saw before, but the other part is him fooling around in Heimat, which is already kind of undermines the whole idea of belonging and authenticity and other things. But this is also part of being, being a middle-class German is also this gymnastics ideas in nature and so forth. However, in the album, this comes together with part of a poem in English. You are old, Father William, and the poem says that you are old, it's not appropriate that you stand on your head. I'm sure that some of you already know where it's from. This is Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. So taking together the whole idea that we saw before of being in Heimat by being part of German bourgeoisie, German bourgeois culture, all that now again is presented as a fantasy or even as a nightmare when it is in the context of Alice in Wonderland. We can go further and go further back, if you will, to the photograph that I showed before of Friedel Wollemstadt and her friends going to nature and playing, acting out the Wandervogel image. So as I said before, this can be seen as part of this pathos of saying we are here too, we belong too, we're part of this nation. However, if you look at the caption below, the caption reads, and so we march around the world. So the caption is obviously a tongue-in-cheek in times where Jews, when they talk about going away, it's not for traveling around the world, it's for emigration when they can. And we need to remember this tongue-in-cheek is rather bitter. The photo was taken just a few months after she is finishing high school. In high school, she went to a high school that was of Jews and non-Jews together. Now she was ousted of this framework. She had to leave her job. She was fired because of being Jewish, and she needed now to find a Jewish employer, to find a new job. And her boyfriend, non-Jewish boyfriend, left her because of the new regulations. So she is all of a sudden very isolated, and therefore, when we look at this photograph in the context of her album, in the context of her narrative, we can see how she uses irony in order to say, this is what we maybe would like to be, but we cannot be. This is the tension between how we would like to imagine ourselves and how things are. So let me conclude here by saying again that Heimat is everywhere in Jewish private photography of the 1930s in Germany. Mostly Heimat appears within these two modes of expressions, either as pathos, as a way to establish belonging in the German bourgeoisie, German bourgeois culture, and therefore belonging in the German homeland. And also it comes within the modes of irony as a way to say, you know, there is this idea of belonging, there is this idea of being authentically part of Germany, the place, and Germany, the culture, by being part of the bourgeoisie, but this is not working. So these are the two poles, and the tensions we see in the photographs are exactly around this idea of what is Heimat for us, and where are we in this German Heimat. Thank you very much.
Thank you for so much for this brilliant lecture about, how shall I put it, different forms of authenticity. To be honest, very different forms of authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like now open the floor for a discussion. Let me explain you how we run the discussion. If you would like to ask Ofer, our speaker, a question, please write your name, and just your name, not the question, just your name in the chat box and press return, so that we can find you on screen and we can then unmute you. You can see the chat function in the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. So off we go. Catherine, I think first question goes to Catherine. Catherine?
Yeah, you've unmuted me. Well, good evening. Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. Oh, do I start my video? Okay. Is that on? Oh, yes, it is. Can you see me now?
Yeah.
Yes, it was a very interesting lecture. I'm particularly interested in this because my mother and my grandmother were Jewish, but my grandmother married a non-German. But of course, sorry, a non-Jewish person. He was German. But of course, once the Nazis came to power, they were very much affected by the Third Reich. And my mother and her two sisters and my grandmother left Germany and came to England. But as some of the photographs that we've seen on the screen, I mean, I have got a lovely photograph of my mother's aunt's 80th birthday event. And just like the group photograph, she sat in the middle, and above her are actually some most wonderful paintings, including very much smaller, which I call it a painting. It's actually a photograph of my mother's aunt when she was about 3 or 4, which then was hand colored, and we still have this in the family. So you have the trappings of family around her, and then she's got some of her nieces and nephews around her, and they all what you would call married out. So their spouses were non-Jews, and then their children were sat on the floor. But it was a typical family, home family photograph celebrating family. So I wondered if has there been any research done into families where one parent is non-Jewish? You know, what does Heimat mean to those families?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question in this regard, and as I said, we have to look at the subjective significance, and by subjective significance, I mean that different families and different background obviously had different concept of what does it mean to belong or not to belong in Germany. So this definitely has to be part of the research. In our project, we have quite a few, so to speak, mixed families, and we try to read the photographs within this context and try to understand what are they trying to do in this photograph. So what do the photograph meant for them when they included it in their albums.
Okay. Well, that it is interesting, but I think that I don't think there's been enough research into what you might call mixed marriages of different religions, and I would like to see more of it, because my mother's family, certainly the Jewish side, are really, really important members of the Berlin Jewish community that can go right back to the 1700s from the research I've done. And somehow they don't seem to be represented anywhere.
I can't talk in general, but I will say that from our perspective, we take whatever we can find. And right now we have a database of some 15,000 photos, and some of them are definitely from mixed marriages, but the vast majority is not. And this is one of the biases that we have, of course, in the research.
Okay, the next question comes from Christina. Christina, over to you.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting. I would like to learn more about the mode of abstraction in the photographs that you also mentioned, but that you didn't show us, simply because I'm curious. And then I have a question about what you called the art of the week, or that basically by taking these photographs, the Jewish authors sent a message to the enemy, if I understood it correctly as well, or used it as a medium of power. Now, how did these photographs ever get outside of their own private circle? And who is the audience or the intended audience of such photographs? And I think it's very enticing as a concept, but I try to make sense of it. And if you talk about the art of the week, would that then mean that only, for example, those emplotments which are ironic would function as this kind of subversive power, or and that the ones that are more employing the pathos as such, they are actually underpinning the enemy's concepts of power, aren't they? I mean, enemy is not the right word here, but I think you probably understand what I mean. And then I wanted to just ask, how do you source your photographs? You said 15,000 photographs, but where do you get them? On flea markets in Israel, in Germany, or in the US? Or I'm just curious.
All right, excellent questions. Let me start with the easy one. Can I share the screen for another second? Let's see. So when I talk about the abstraction, I talk about images like that they are in places where you would expect to see these Heimat imagery that we've seen thus far, but the photos actually takes the subject of the photographs out of this context. And what we saw, as you can see here, this is all from Herbert Simon's collection. What we see is a collection that goes year after year with the same photos that don't show us anything about the context. Meaning we have photographs that are abstracted from the social, let's say, historical, political context. What we see is generic photos of middle-class Europeans, right? And they have their own functions. Mostly, it's within the discourse of what is essential, and you can see that essentially nothing has changed, right? From 34, 35, 36, 37, if we have the same photos year after year, we basically show that essentially nothing in our life changed, and it's part of the discourse of what's going on here, trying to understand what is happening in Third Reich Germany. So this is the kind of photos that we see. Mostly in albums, we see this combination. So just like in the Dineman album, you have lots of obstructions, right? Photos that show from short range, you don't see where it is, you don't know anything about it. It could have been anywhere in Europe between the wars. But then in the end, you have this Heimat point to say, okay, all that, this is, it means to be part of Heimat, right? So this is the abstraction. The question about the maneuver in the enemy's field, I thought it was a great metaphor, but it's, I mean, obviously we have to take what we can from it. It's not, I don't think it's against an enemy. What they do is they appropriate language, they appropriate the visual language. They take the iconography of Heimat and out of the context that it's supposed to be, again, under Nazism. The Heimat was part of Jewish culture as much as it was of non-Jewish culture, but within the Nazi framework, they don't belong there, right? So they take it and make it part of their own story, part of their own narrative in the album. The question is how they do it. And here the pathos and irony go, they are important because I wouldn't want to look at it only, is it subversive or non-subversive, right? It's, I think it's a matter of how we build our story and what do we want to do with Heimat, and how we conceive the notion of belonging in Germany, of authentic belonging in Germany, and this is where it is. I hope I don't miss anything. Where do I get there? I think the question is not where you get those photos, but where you don't get them. They are everywhere. So we went to big archives like the Jewish Museum in Berlin and the U.S. Holocaust Historical Museum and Yad Vashem, of course. But we also went to small towns in Germany and their municipal museums, and they have treasures in archives. We went to museums, Jewish museums around the globe, in Australia, for example. And then we asked families to give us. So we were in contact through all these social networks of Yekes and asked for albums. And people were very willing, enthusiastic to give us albums. Some of them were actually still the survivors, mostly the ones that were children, and so we could also interview them. Mostly as families that just didn't know what to do with the albums, and were very happy that someone was interested.
Emilie Steinhauer, you're next, and then Bernd Weisbrot.
Thank you so much. I think this was really interesting, and part of it reminded me really of my own research on exiles who returned after the Second World War, and intellectual culture kind of try to place themselves again into this longer German canon as a kind of act of reclaiming. So I think in some ways it seems to correspond as kind of proactive and actually kind of taking agency and placing yourself within this longer story. But my question was specifically a bit more about the sources again, because I think this is really interesting, this kind of survival of these kind of material, these objects. And I was wondering whether these albums were always constructed or put together, compiled at the time as people were going along, or whether there's any evidence that maybe these were also put together by family members later, whether we can see some kind of curating exercise happening, at least in some of them. And then how do these albums I mean, you've said a bit about it already in your response just then. How are they kind of kept in families? Do they become these treasured objects that also for later generations hold some kind of value, also intellectually, maybe linking it back to an older idea? Or do you have any sort of information about that? Thank you.
Yeah, very good way to conceptualize this. So basically, in this project, I only look at albums that were compiled in the 1930s, before they left Germany. Some of my students are looking at albums that were compiled later, and and then there are questions of memory and how you reconstruct, reclaim memory, and so forth. But this is not part of this project. I just wanted to see the way they tell themselves the narrative in the 1930s, but of course they do it for the future generation. So it's obviously something that they want to show. This is how we used to live. This was the meaning of being us in Nazi Germany. So this is the context, and I think that what you asked about what is the meaning of it for the families is very important. It changes for the second generation. It was something that that was part of the family story, part of the family treasure. They looked at it, they knew the photos. Third generation, really, it's not that they don't care, it's just that it doesn't say anything to them. They don't know who are the people in the photos. And I do know some of the people that I interviewed recorded their parents and grandparents looking at the albums and explaining what it is. And some of it is obviously invaluable information for us. But this is rare. Most of the time, it loses, the people lose interest.
Bernd Weisbrot.
Hi, Ofer.
Hi,
Thank you. The problem, of course, is that this is a highly homogenized genre, and not just the photograph itself and the visual culture, but also the album. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And that, of course, is very difficult to handle. And I think you're doing a good job in getting at some of the important internal problems. But I would ask you to step out of the sources for once and add two aspects that maybe makes it easier for you to actually define what it is that you are seeing. The one step outside is how do you relate it with the literature that we have on Jews and Heimat? I mean, for example, Philip Nielsen's book on the conservative and nationalist Jews were very proud to be in the Heimatbewegung, in the Reichsbund Jüdischer Frontsoldaten, or Miriam Rüruph's book on the Jewish corporations that were, delivering the same sort of visual culture than the non-Jewish corporations. So I think you're talking about the Jewish authors of these visual remnants, but there are different Jewish cultures, as you know, and I'm asking this because I don't think you can do without that sort of analysis that we have already and relate it to what you see. And the second point is, did you try in collecting these family albums ever think of comparing them vigorously with non-Jewish family albums at the same time? I invite you to come to Berlin next time, and I'll give you the family album of my mother, and you'll have exactly the same visual culture. And my question is, it may well be that it's just the captions of the same pictures that make them acquire this ironic quality, whereas the visual repertoire is almost identical with non-Jewish albums that I know. These were the two questions.
Thank you, Bernd. Good to see you. So yeah, let me start with the second question, which I find very interesting. So I did a little bit of that together with Maiken Umbach, who works on non-Jewish albums of the time, and I think you're obviously right that we see very similar images. My point would be that even if we see the same image, it's just like the photo that I showed of the Hitler Jugend March, right? It has different meaning for a Jewish teenager who watches it from afar than non-Jewish teenager who watches the same thing and take the same photograph. And it has different meaning within the family narrative in the album. So I think the point is not that the photographs are different, it's just that the meaning within the context of their lives, of their experiences are different. And this is what I'm trying to reconstruct, this subjective meaning. And this would connect me to your other question. What I would try to do is to connect it to the discourse you mentioned, or the various different discourses. So we have Zionist and we have German nationalists, right? And that Nielsen talks about, and so forth. And what I see is how the photos reflect on those discourses. How do you incorporate a certain discourse into your family narrative? That's the basic question. So obviously, in the project, I can't do without the scholarship that you mentioned. This is part of it. The question is how private lives were infected by this intellectual discourse, by these organizations, by the ideologies and practices in organizations. What filters down to the family life, the way the family thinks of itself and wants to present itself? That's the main question.
And Baeck, you had a question too. Has Ofer already answered the question? You want to come in? And Baeck? Okay, if it's fine for Anne, then I would like to come in, maybe also, okay, Anne said we have answered it. I would like to come in and maybe also comment a bit on Bernd Weisbord's question, which is an important one. However, I have to say, these pictures from the mountains, if I look at my family's albums, we do have the same pictures. Ofer, you know some of them, right? Mm-hmm. And you can see me as a little kid, stand in the Swiss Alps on the top of the mountains. You always have a flag, the Swiss flag, right? And you can see me, little kid, standing behind these Swiss flags. But for us, this has a very different meaning. Being Jewish, hiking in the Swiss Alps, it's very different for us standing there than for Christian Swiss people. It has really a different meaning. This has to be with the context which Ofer is trying to decipher. It's really something totally different for various reasons. So I think it must have been different there in the 1930s too. For, of course, different reasons than for us Swiss Jews in the 1970s, 1980s. Just a comment to Bernd. But these emotions are very different, difficult to decipher on these images. And I think Ofer has probably found a way, when he asked for pathos and irony, to see behind the imagery, so to speak. My question has to do with pathos and these albums. Do these albums finish in Nazi Germany, or do they continue after Nazi Germany? Or in other words, does the notion of Heimat changes when suddenly, you know, if you look, for example, Hechalot Seminar or the Kibbutz Habonim album, when the next picture is in Mandate Palestine, for example, or in the UK or in the USA?
Yes, that's an excellent question that I cannot answer yet because I limited myself to this part of the album. And you're right that the albums continue, and if not this album, it will be in the next album, that the family narrative continues in albums, and the questions that you raise are at the center of those albums. So I didn't do a systematic analysis of these albums, even though I have quite a few of them, and I intend to in the near future. I can say from what I saw is that you can learn a lot of the family self-perception as Germans once they get outside of Germany. And for some families, for example, you can see, for example, the family that goes to Palestine, the Porat family that we saw a photo from it. In 1936, they actually escape. They take advantage of one of the programs of Kraft durch Freude and go outside of Germany as tourists, and then they escape the group and go to Palestine. But if you look at their album, you don't think of emigration. It looks like one of their trips. They had trips before in Europe. They had trips before to Palestine. And it just looks like one of their tourist trips. And I don't think it's a surprise that some of the family members just leave Palestine or Israel once they can and go back, or go to other places, but they're not very Zionist. So you can look at albums and see the way they think of themselves, the way they think of their identity, from the way they narrate in photographs, narrate the story of the immigration, just like the story of being in Germany.
Mm-hmm. Maybe to add another question, which again goes back to Bernd's question, you know, what are your tools, you know, to decipher these kind of messages which were meant to be for the family members? As I see from your examples, you need, on one hand, you need a text, you know, a comment, so you see the difference, or you need several pictures one after one, and you suddenly see it has a twist in there. I mean, what are your main kind of tools you need to decipher and come to the bottom of these kind of hidden agendas or messages? For us, hidden agendas as a message, not for the family, but for us.
So I think obviously if I have a series of photographs in an album and I have the story, I can reconstruct the story, it's great. If I have a caption, it's great because obviously you can see you can use that to understand what's going on. I'm more interested, just my curiosity, it's not that it's more important, but I'm more interested in those photos where we just found, you know, a pile of photos. We don't know how they were organized and there is no captions. Mm-hmm. What those orphan images can tell us. And in that case, I think we can, first of all, we need to see enough of them to see patterns, to see what is common and what is exceptional. So this is very important. Second thing is to see how it relates to the visual culture of the time. As the example I gave of the Heimat iconography is a case in point. We know how Heimat iconography, visual iconography should look like, how it looks in postcards and how it looks in many, many, many albums. And now we should see, okay, you know, we should ask ourselves, how does this particular photograph appropriate this iconography? What do they do with this iconography? Just like in the Rosenthal photos where they place themselves they take the kitschiest image of Heimat on the Alps and place themselves at the center of that, right? And not themselves as, as if they were farmers. We see that too. Some families that they dress the kids as in Tracht and they put them on the mountains as if they were, part of this culture. No, it's them as tourists on the mountain, bourgeois tourists on the mountains at the center of this kitsch image. So we don't need to know a lot about the specific order of the album to understand what they're trying to do there. And again, these modes of expressions are the main analytical tools that I have.
Okay. May I come in with another question? And I was very struck again by I'm not quite sure if it's a Chalutz seminar picture or the Kibbutz Habonim. I think it was a Kibbutz Habonim picture with the church. Can you elaborate a bit more about this going together of bourgeois German Heimat, visual imagery, and Zionist imagery in Germany?
Yeah, I think it's, at first when I looked at Heimat, I thought it will be, the liberal Jews, the ones who are staying through the 1930s and they want to show belonging in Germany and so forth. But you see many others, and one of the other types that you see is the Zionist. And surprisingly, the Zionists have typical or cliche Heimat imagery almost in all of their albums. Sometimes it will be on the Alps, sometimes it will be by the Rhine. So you see them, their kibbutz or their camp, the Hachshara camp, is on the bank of the Rhine, and you have these great images that look like the best Heimat kitsch you can see, with the two banks of the Rhine, and the churches and the fields and their kibbutzes in the middle. And it's clear that it looked to them like the best way that they could describe their kibbutz, and what the kibbutz is doing is through that. And usually it comes at the beginning. So you have, the narrative goes that you have this kibbutz in the Heimat, then you have all these close-ups, images of the people in the kibbutz doing the agricultural training, and then in the end you see them going out to the fields again, something like that. So it's you usually think of two Heimats, right, of the Zionists, that they have two homelands, and one is in Palestine and one is in Germany, and you have all these poems of I have roots here and there and so forth. When you look at the albums, what you see is there is one Heimat, and it gives them identity in both places, in both lands.
Christina has another question.
Yes, I was wondering about the class aspect of the photos, because you mentioned it several times that this is middle class territory and educated middle class, I guess. And I also guess it from the motifs, the Wandervogel or the alpine ski vacation, seems very upper middle class or educated middle class to me. However, I think, as you mentioned at the beginning, cameras were really quite affordable, and in the working classes, there would have probably also have been a lot of family albums and photographs. And do you see any differences between working class, petit bourgeois, and upper middle class Jewish photographs?
Yes, excellent. So two things that I want to say about it. One of them is that we do have a bias of the photographs that we have. So we have photographs of people who kept them, and mostly people who left Germany before 1939. We have some photographs that goes to 1945, people were in hiding, but mostly is the people who kept it. And I won't get into the reasons, but most of these reservoirs belong to middle class and not working class. It doesn't have to be upper middle class. Some of them are, middle or lower middle class. But even the lower middle class, at least in 1935, 36, still went on vacations. Yes, and sometimes it wasn't that fancy, and they wouldn't go to Austria, or they wouldn't go to be tourists in Italy like some of the families that we have. But we have similar scenes. That's on one hand. On the other hand, you do see differences of class when you look at photographs of home, right? When you look at the kind of furniture that they have, and when the way that they, if they live in an apartment in the city, you have a lot of narratives in albums that are about our building, the apartment building within the city, and you will see, trying to think of the city as the place where we live, and which is, we see more in lower middle class than in upper middle class, where many of them live in very nice places outside of the city, at least at the beginning in 33, 34, then they move and we see the movement. So each family has its own story, and we can see that. We can see the class differences in those albums. And having said that, many of the scenes are very similar. So even the lower middle class that we see try to emulate upper middle class scenes. Sometimes you see that they're changing their clothes, and sometimes they go on the mountains as if they're going skiing, even though they're going just outside of the city, to the forest outside of the city.
So no football teams in the working class albums, or?
We have football teams, yes, definitely. There's a lot of sports photographs, but I wouldn't necessarily expose it to working class. It actually, if you have the leisure to belong to a club and you have the time to play, usually, at least in our albums, it's the upper middle class more than the lower middle class.
I have a question which just came up listening to Christina's question. It's not about class, it's about gender. There's this big debate within German Jewish history, modern German Jewish history, who's in charge of the tradition. That's a gender question very often. How is this applied to your Heimat topic? Does it make a difference whether daddy or whether mama takes the picture?
Yeah, very good question. So as I said before, everybody takes pictures, and we have lots of collections and albums that were taken by female photographers or compiled by female, like the mother or one of the teenage daughters of the family, or a female of the group of kids. So some of the photos that you've seen were by female photographers or of a female owner of an album. Now, the question is, where do we see gender is more tricky. Mm-hmm. Here, I focused on landscape photography, and in the landscape photography, I haven't seen a lot of differences. I say it cautiously because I mean, it needs more research. However, when you look in more general terms, the kind of narratives that teenage women, for example, have, and teenage boys, you see difference in narratives, difference in what they show. But again, not necessarily in terms of what kind of landscape photographs they show, but how it relates to their story, how it relates to questions, for example, to questions of religion. Mm-hmm. In many of the young male albums. We see these images of Heimat and bourgeois leisure culture, and then images that are related to religion, artifacts, tefillin, for example. And for some reasons, when you look at teenage girls, you see much less of that. It's almost not there at all. But again, it's not. I don't want to. It's not a general conclusion, right? It really depends on what is the function of it in the story. For example, many of the teenage boys, they are making a point in their albums that those tefillins are of the past. We don't use them anymore. So they have the photo, but they say we don't use them anymore. Mm-hmm. Right? Where in female, we don't see these photos at all. So.
Okay.
But can I say one more thing about that? Everything I said thus far in answer to your question, I think is less important. Because even, as I said before, even if we see the same images, it has different meaning for a teenage woman, 30-something woman, or a middle-aged man. It's different. It has a different. The same image has different meaning within her narrative.
If there are no other questions, then I would like to bring our evening on Zoom to an end. And my thanks go out to Ofer for this extremely brilliant lecture, extremely visual lecture about very different forms of authenticity and Jewish visual culture and Jewish visual language and emotions linked to Heimat, whatever Heimat is or used to be. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I hope I see you again for our next lecture, which will probably be again on Zoom. So good night to everybody, and thanks a lot for joining in.